Sorry, Susan Teller.
And Susan is the other county-wide gifted coordinator. And we're getting our PowerPoint up for you. We tried to get in early, so we were all set. I apologize that we weren't let into the room until late, but here we go. All right. So we've already introduced ourselves from being from Broward County Schools. We're here today to talk about equity and gifted throughout the country, but we're going to focus specifically on Broward County Schools. I'm going to turn off my camera so we can focus more on the presentation. So Florida, gifted in different states comes with different types of requirements. And in Florida, our foundation is that a gifted student, it's based in their IQ. So it's a 130 IQ for gifted. In some of other states, for instance, Texas or Washington State, they have gifted and talented programs so that it is not based on IQ. It could be that their talent is in academics, it could be in the arts, it could be in sports. But one of the things that we found in our research is the states that have switched to a gifted and talented program tend not to fund those programs. In Florida, gifted is funded. There is an additional 0.2 FTE dollars. So for instance, if we were normally given $6,000 for a student, if they were gifted, we'd get $7,200. Criteria in Florida, and then in Broward, we actually bring that up to a 1.5 so that we can make sure that we have the additional funds to help with enrichment programs or special training for teachers or materials that we may need. When I was a teacher at the Gifted Academy, the majority of the books that I used in my class were not the ones that were part of the middle school recommendations. So we did have to buy additional books. So in Florida, a Plan A student, which means the basic criteria for Plan A is a 130 IQ and a majority of characteristics on a gifted indicators checklist, meaning that the teacher through observation would literally goes through a checklist and says whether or not they see it all the time, sometimes just a little bit of the time. And it didn't matter whether or not it was a constant trait for that student or whether it was something that they only saw in an area of interest, but all of those indicators count. And out of the 50 indicators, they would need 26 or more for that qualification. And then there's the need for services. And this is the one that is up to interpretation and part of the eligibility meeting. The parent is a member of the team. There's the psychologist that has done the IQ or that is interpreting the data if it's come from a private report. Or if somebody else did the test and they are the psychologist assigned, especially our charter schools use the same psychologist, but they don't have them assigned directly to each school the way that we do for the public schools. So a psychologist is there to interpret that data. And then the LEA or the local educational advocate is there, who's usually the ESE specialist. And then the teacher of the gifted, who can also talk about the need for services, as well as the gen ed teacher that currently has the student. Very often those students are in gifted high achiever classes already because they had been identified through test scores that they should be in that class. I see somebody saying they don't have, oh, you can hear me talking. Okay, good. You scared me a minute when I saw that somebody said they didn't have audio. So, one of the things that we're looking for then at the meeting is not only is there a qualifying IQ and a majority of indicators, but also a need for services. So if we're looking at a student who has a 130 IQ and has 26 or more of those indicators, but is reading below grade level, would we really need to make them gifted? And in some cases, we'll say yes, because they may be underachieving because they're bored, or maybe they're not gifted in reading, but they are gifted in math. One of the things that we recognize in terms of our gifted students is that they may not be gifted across the curriculum. Very often as the language arts teacher at the Gifted Academy, I would have students that were anywhere from 3 to 6 years ahead in math, but they really couldn't write a decent essay. they obviously had a gift in math, and then we were giving them enrichment maybe in English language arts as we tried to make those skills match. But one of the things that we know about gifted students is that they do have asynchronous development, meaning that they will not necessarily mature equally intellectually as they do emotionally, and that in the areas of intellect, it may only be in one area that they are gifted, or maybe they're only showing signs of giftedness if it is an area of interest. So yes, I'm seeing in the chat somebody is asking if you'll have access to the PowerPoint. We did send it in for it to be included as part of the app. So there are some links that are coming up later as well. You can also, we'll have our contact information as our last slide. So you can also email myself or Susan or look us up as presenters. And if for some reason it is not showing up for you, we are more than willing to share it with you. So the question becomes, if we're looking for a 130 IQ and we're looking for those indicators, does that really give us equity across the board? And you'll see in our first column that we talk about studies have shown that students who are growing up in a low SES household tend not to be raised in a text-rich environment. So it's more rare for our FRL students to come into school reading. And you know, one of the things that I've seen with my students as they come in is that I had a student who lived in a family that they were an immigrant family, they were English language learners, they were FRL, and every adult in the house was working multiple jobs. And so there was no one there reading to them at night. They would try to read to each other, and the older kids were trying to force the younger kids to get their homework done. But priorities were different for those students. And therefore, we started to look at, is it equitable for us to say that all students, regardless of where they come from or their language that they speak at home, should they all have the same IQ? We also know that when we look at standardized testing in general, there tends to be bias in terms of the test questions. We even just had, when we were first looking at the FSA coming to Florida, and they gave us an example of the PARCC exam, which is what was being used in North Carolina and New York, there were a lot of questions about icy roads and in the middle school level at least, that were weather related that our students had no idea because they had no context for them. So even though it wasn't an intellectual deficiency there was an experiential difference there. So we wanted to, so one of the things that we started looking at was how is the representation in gifted compared to the representation racially and financially within the state of Florida. And one of the things that came up was that we had the majority of students who were listed as gifted in the state of Florida tended to be white. Imagine that, right? So when Plan B, so we called that 130 IQ that I started talking about Plan A now, because now we have a Plan A and a Plan B. Plan B came about when we started looking at different racial populations, and there was a great disparity in the percentages of students that were English language learners, or if they were low SES, or if they were a student of color. They were less represented in the areas of gifted across Florida and actually across the United States. It's not just our state that has that inequity. So the state of Florida came up with the idea of Plan B. So the original giftedness, or the ability to be identified as gifted, started in Florida in 1983. And then in 1991, they came up with, when they started looking racially, that inequity, they came up with Plan B. One of the ideas that they came up with was that each county could determine their own status for Plan B. So in Florida, right now, only 5 counties have a registered Plan B plan. The bigger counties like Miami-Dade and Broward and Orange County, Palm Beach County all have Plan B. And they get to choose what would be IQ requirement, and what other requirements could we use in order to make sure that we could try and get some more of those underrepresented students into those gifted programs. So Plan B is defined as being low SES or ELL. And in our county, rather than the 130 IQ, we require a 115 and then 10 points on the gifted eligibility matrix. When we first had Plan B start in the state of Florida, they actually had it broken down by racial groups, that if you were a student of color or if you were a Hispanic student, so African American, Hispanic students were listed as Plan B. So it was done by race rather than by social status. There was a complaint by the ACLU that even though we were looking for those underrepresented populations, that breaking it down or identifying the students by race as part of the process did not seem fair. And that's when it changed from looking for African American students, looking for Hispanic students. They changed it to low SES students or English language learners to be part of Plan B. The gifted eligibility matrix, which is the last part, you notice in Plan A, we had the majority of indicators on the gifted indicators checklist. Instead, here we have an eligibility matrix. And the matrix is looking at what the student's IQ is, what their achievement scores are. Again, we have an indicators checklist, but we're only going to look at 4 out of the 5 areas. Whatever their highest scores are the ones that we're going to choose to use. And then we're also looking at if they are ELL, they get an additional point. If they're SES, they get an additional point. And there's a gifted traits indicator where they can also get an additional 2 points. So the goal, rather than that 130 IQ, was changed then to a 115 IQ in Broward and 10 points on the gifted eligibility matrix. Different counties have different requirements. In Miami-Dade, it's a 113 instead of 115 that we use. We used to be 116, but a standard mean is 15 points on an IQ test. And so we've tried to simplify it by making it 1 standard mean above the norm for Plan B and 2 standard means above the norm for Plan A. So if the average adult in the United States has an IQ of a 100, in order to be gifted in Plan B, it was 1 mean above. For Plan A, 2 means above. And there's a variety of tests that are accepted. I see that there are some examples that have been put into the chat for us. Thank you very much. And also that the test must be performed by a licensed psychologist in the state. So one of the things that we found as we were moving forward is that whether we've received our students through Plan A with that 130 IQ or through Plan B, or from a private psychological report that the parent went out and paid for, regardless of how we found them, when we look at their statistics in terms of attendance, grades, GPA, standardized test scores, and graduation, they all excel. So regardless of how we get them, once we have them segregated into a room with intellectual peers, they are successful. So it doesn't matter as much how we find them. The point is that we do identify them and that we do focus on students that are in a gifted high achiever class or a gifted only class where everyone is proficient or beyond. And then we create an education plan, which is where we are documenting how we're going above and beyond the curriculum. So how do we find that in our system? One of the changes that has happened because of privacy laws and FERPA is that we no longer see who is an FRL student in BASIS, even though we can still see whether or not they are ELL. But if you have access to EdPlan in Broward County, all of our teachers do have access to students who are participating in any of our exceptional programs. And on their student information page, we can see if they are ELL. You'll see that there are some red letters, LY, LF, LA. Those are the different scores in ESOL that qualify as Plan B. So even though a student may have tested out or in the follow-up period after having graduated out of the ESOL program, they're still considered English language learners. We know that in terms of the test and test bias, that they may still not know some of the intricacies of the language. For instance, in our screening, one of the questions is, what is very far away can only be seen at night and twinkles in the sky. Well, those of us that are born and raised in the United States have all heard twinkle, twinkle, little star. If you were born somewhere else, you may not catch that the word twinkle is referring to a star instead of the moon. And so star or planet is an acceptable answer, moon is not. So again, even in our screener, we can see some of that bias. And that's one of the reasons that even if they've been exited from ESOL and are only being tracked for their success, we still give them credit for Plan B. Also on the same page of student info in EdPlan, we can see whether or not a student has been identified as an FRL student, free and reduced lunch. It doesn't matter what status within FRL they are in order to be part of Plan B. One of the issues, and Susan will talk about this a little bit later when she starts going over some statistics with you.
One of the things I want to make sure of.
Laura, your microphone's on.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Nice to see you. One of the
nice to see you too.
One of the things that that we've noticed is that with FRL, in the past year since we've been giving free meals to everybody, not everybody is doing that paperwork. But anytime that they become an FRL student, that would count towards Plan B, even if they apply for free and reduced lunch after the testing has concluded. So there's a little bit of glitch there in some ways, but we want to make sure that it is as fair as possible, especially as we're trying to increase the underrepresented populations. And speaking of that, we're going to play you a little video just to let you know the interviewer in this case is Donna Ford, who has actually been a guest in our district, and she was working in Nashville at the time. I believe now she's moved up to Ohio, but she is a specialist in the areas of underrepresented population. Can someone just let us know if you're hearing the sound?
I can't hear it, Jacob.
I have my sound on.
No sound. Okay, so best laid plans of mice and men. Our sound obviously is not coming through on the Zoom call, so we'll continue on. But basically, the information that they were given reinforces what we were talking about, that as we look on a national level at representation, and we'll show you actual statistics in our state and in our county, that the representation, especially of Black students in gifted programs, is much lower than the percentage of students that are in the program overall, that the majority, as I mentioned earlier, the majority of participants in the gifted program tend to be white or Asian rather than Hispanic or Black. And so as we've gone through and looking for ways to increase those numbers, and we'll talk about some things that we do here in Broward, but we also have around the country some promise programs that are coming up, not to be confused with Broward's promise, which is more about legal issues, but students who are showing intellectual promise but may not have that vocabulary, as we were talking about earlier, or we showed in an earlier slide, that a student who is low SES tends to enter school with 1/2 to 1/3 the vocabulary of a student who is from an upper middle class or upper class family. And so in these promise programs, there's one in North Carolina, one in South Carolina, for instance, they are chosen to go into an accelerated program, knowing that once we get them exposed, that they will have a better chance of passing those tests that bring them to eligibility. So if we look, here's a look at the Florida student population. You can see this is a few years old. It actually says that it's 42% white students. It's actually now down to 37%. But we wanted to show you what it looked like racially, and we're going to compare from the same year two different pie charts. So the yellow portion is the white students, green is Black students, red is Hispanic. You can see the Asian is 2.5%, but you'll see when we get over to those identified for gifted that the pie chart is not going to look the same. So here, remember, we were only at 45% white students. However, in gifted programs, it's 53.7% are white. And even though there's only 2.4% Asian students across, in general, 6% of Asian students had been identified as gifted. And if we look, only 9% of students who are Black were identified as gifted, even though they made up 40% of the students in the state. So we can see that the inequities are definitely there. And one of the things that our department and our district has been striving for is to equalize those underrepresented populations and to find ways to get them into the fold, so to speak. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the statistics, and then we're going to talk about why they may not be identified by their teachers for recommending them. We know that one of the reasons, especially with the Asian population, that one of the reasons that that number always tends to be high regardless of what state we're in is because of the parent commitment to education that goes on, that students in lower SES families tend not to have as much parent representation in meetings, in the PTA, in coming and volunteering at the school, because their focus is more on financial issues rather than going in and fighting for their students, saying, you know, my child is bored, or my child has behavior issues because they're not being challenged in their work, or because they're finishing their work early and has nothing to do. So one of the reasons that we see across the board that there is less representation is for low SES students, whether or not the parents are out there fighting for their children's rights.
Okay, so we've already discussed this, so I'm just going to skip that. You're going to mute.
Okay, so that should work. Okay, so you can see in this graph that when you look at the total number of students who are gifted in the state of Florida compared to the total number of students who are ELL in the state, it's a 9%, almost 10%, 10% in the state, whereas our in the state, only 1.6% are categorized under ELL. I do want to let you know that we're only looking at students that are currently ELL, English language learners, now. So if they were identified previously as an English language learner and they are no longer considered ELL, they would not be counted in this number. The next one I have is free and reduced lunch. When you look at the percentage of students in the state that are free and reduced lunch, 34% of the gifted population in the state are free and reduced lunch. But when we look at our numbers in our district, I'm not looking at the percentage of gifted. We're going to be looking at compared to the total numbers. So it does look a little different. So you can see that from 2018 to 2019, even though we lost students in our district, our number of gifted students went up. And even though our numbers went up, the number of ELL students that are categorized as gifted went down. And we're at a 1% as of the last data that we had. Comparatively, again, to the total number of percentage of students in our district, which is 3%. So it is a disparity. Low SES, again, we're looking at percentages Again, our numbers went up, number of gifted students in the district, and number of low SES went up, but we're still comparatively to the numbers of students in our.
So crazy.
I-
But I didn't get picked that time, and I was
They gave
so
it to
upset. They gave it to that crazy one. Right. They called me
Okay,
and said,
so
I'm sorry for principal.
3% of our low SES students out of the total number of students are in the gifted program. So there's still a big disparity there as well. So one of the things that you can do to look and see if you if your gifted population at your school is equitable compared to the ethnic breakdown of your school is to go to the Broward Schools website and go to Our Schools. Once you do that, you go to Our Schools on the home page, you can find your school, whether it's elementary, middle, or high. And once you click on your school's name, you'll see that you can find the information. So you can do a calculation to see how many white students are gifted, what percentage are gifted out of the whole population. Same thing for Black, African American, Hispanic, and Asian, which is usually where you look. So you can determine that as well. So again, when you're looking at trying to find students, one of the things that you can do is use BASIS. Again, it's achievement scores. It's not going to so much help you so much with the kids that are underachievers or, you know, may not be the person, I'm going the wrong way, sorry, you would normally choose, but it does help you determine at least the top 10% of the students that are high achieving. So you can determine based, on certain categories as well with race and ELL. You can no longer look and get free and reduced lunch from BASIS, but you can export it and then do the top 10%. One of the things that I also look for when we do pilot programs are for the students that may have a 5 in math and a 3 or a 2 in reading. And those are some of the students that I might refer as well, or ask to be tested or screened. Because if they have some disparity, either they might have a disability, or it just may be that they're really strong in one area, and just like Jacob said, you don't have to be gifted in all areas to be gifted in the state of Florida for eligibility. So that's one way to do it. And I do recommend that you do that and then look at other ways to identify others. So that helps. We also want to look to see if our population and our gifted population match. For example, if you have 30% Black in your school, you should have a gifted population with about 30% Black students. Statistically, it's acceptable to be plus or minus 10%, but if it's more than that, you need to evaluate how you're identifying your students. Either you're over-identifying or under-identifying. So
we brought up that we have these underrepresented population. That we have these underrepresented populations. So what have we done about it? Broward actually has been applauded nationally because of our universal screening program. We were one of the first counties to begin one. We actually test all second grade students for gifted. Even though the state says that gifted services start in kindergarten and they run through 12th grade, we found that doing the testing in second grade, we actually give them the COGAT, and we get a very good response as to the students that pass the COGAT. Again, we use a different score for Plan A and Plan B. For Plan A, they need 97% or higher in all 3 areas that are tested. And for Plan B, we're looking for 81% or higher in 2 out of the 3 areas that are tested. And we actually had a great increase a couple of years ago in terms of universal screening. When universal screening for the first 10 years or so that we were doing it, we changed tests. Number one, we started using the NAT. and we got a very large number of students to test, but the percentage of students who actually then passed to become part of Plan B or Plan A was low. So we switched to the COGAT, and we had a much better hit rate in terms of the students that were identified for full evaluation, also then becoming identified as gifted. At the time, we were saying that because of the lower expectations in terms of vocabulary, if they're not raised in a text-rich environment, that we would just look at the nonverbal and the quantitative scores, which is more about problem solving and math. However, Susan mentioned earlier a pilot program, and the pilot program that Suzelle Rodriguez, our supervisor, had begun is that we go out to schools that have less than 3% gifted, because they say 3 to 4% of the population should be gifted, and we'll go out and test either the top 10% of the school, or we ask, each teacher to recommend 2 or 3 students for screening for gifted. And when we were doing this about 5 years ago, we noticed that when we were testing these Plan B students, sometimes their verbal score was higher than their nonverbal score. So we changed the way that we identify students from universal screening. It was that we were just looking at nonverbal and quantitative. We changed it for the 2 highest areas so that it could be nonverbal quantitative, it could be verbal quantitative, or nonverbal and verbal. So once we did that, we went from about we test about 13,000 students a year. We were getting about 550 students back to go forward for full evaluation. And the year that we changed that criteria to any 2 areas, we went up by 300 students. It was literally a 40% increase in the number of students who are identified through COGAT to go forward for full evaluation. So one of the things that we noticed from the chart that's up now, 28% of the students that passed either Plan A or Plan B were already identified as gifted, but that left us with 72% of other students who had not been tested at all, or maybe they didn't pass a screener in their school at an earlier age, or they hadn't passed their first IQ test in order to be eligible for gifted. But as we move forward, we found that more of them were being identified and successful in those programs. And you can see from the statistics that we have up here, 74% of the students that passed the COGAT were on free and reduced lunch, and 29% were ELL. Sometimes it's a combination of both, but we did find that with having 850 more students to test each year based on universal screening, that our numbers were finally increasing. So one of the questions that comes up in terms of recommendations, as we said, for the pilot program, any teacher or parent or member of any stakeholder can actually recommend a student for screening for gifted. But one of the things that we kind of confuse is the difference between a high achiever and a gifted student. So a high achiever is the student that does whatever the teacher wants, and no matter what, they're going to get an A. It doesn't matter if they have to memorize the textbook or do 13 projects instead of the 10 projects that everyone else is doing, because they're going to have, they want 130% in their grade book in Pinnacle. Versus the gifted student, who may or may not complete their work, or they may complete it and not turn it in. They have more questions about why are they learning this information, or in developing their schema so that they could use the information, they need more real world connections to our content. And so they are pushing and questioning their teachers more. And one of the things that we find is that gifted students may do their work and it's in their backpack, because for them, the learning process was important, while turning in the work and getting the A was not important. The other thing that we found is that our gifted students tend to be more selective consumers, and they may only want to apply themselves in their areas of interest. And one of my favorite stories is my student who I could barely get out of middle school, and my students looped with me. So every quarter for 3 years, I was calling mom saying, if I could get these 4 things, he can get a D in my class. And he ended up being a valedictorian at his high school. And he said, when I asked him how he went from, barely passing middle school to valedictorian, he said, well, you taught middle school, your grades didn't count. But my math classes were high school classes, so I got all A's in those because they were going to count towards my GPA.
So many people, okay, turn yours. Many.
Secure guy. You can't fix that. You don't back that up, Cleaver. You play me. You make me look like a little bitch. All right? I love her.
Susan, you're muted. I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Sorry. Okay, so there's a big difference between a high achiever and a gifted learner, yet I think most teachers think of the gifted learner as a high achiever, or they think the gifted learner is the high achiever. They're the ones that'll sit in class, they'll do their work without questioning. They want, straight A's, they know what they have to do. They're happy to, be, working in groups. And they learn quickly, but not as quickly as a gifted child. Whereas a gifted student, if they're not interested or do not see a connection as to why they're learning something, they may tune out. If it's interesting to them, they can also become consumed with it to the point where that's the only thing that they will learn about. Many of them also prefer to be with like-minded and intellectual peers, and can seem disengaged or out of sort. They don't necessarily get along with their age peers, or they don't have anything in common with their age peers. Many of those kids you'll see sitting at recess talking to the teacher because they like to have adult conversations. They learn something in 1 to 2 tries and then don't understand why they have to keep doing something 25 times to show that they know it. So that's learning how to identify what a gifted learner is as opposed to a high achiever is an important skill that teachers need to learn how to do. So the barriers that we find in school are that teachers don't really know how to identify those students. Again, there's also people who feel that in certain populations, you're not going to find gifted students. And we know that's not true as well. A lot of, kids they have focus on remediation rather than developing their strong skills. They may have language barriers. The environment, they may be going page to page in a math book, or doing iReady, and there's no reason, in their opinion, to show, how, smart they are or show what they know. Teachers may not nominate because they don't want students to be taken from their room. A lot of times students with disabilities go unnoticed. Even though they have disabilities, they may be able to perform well in one area and it may hide their disability. So having checklists are a very helpful way to identify those students, looking at motivation. Those students who are persistent, in certain self-selected tasks. Many of those students could question authority. They have to know why they're doing something. And if it doesn't relate to them or to what they're learning, they may tune out. And they're usually looked as troublemakers, but they're not troublemakers. They just want to understand why something is the way it is. Again, they have very laser focused on a topic and they may become consumed. They move around often and sometimes they're considered ADD or ADHD because they're always moving. They also may ask unusual or embarrassing questions that, could, turn some people off. And they also have a high sense of humor. So they may have seem like the class clown at times when they're really not the class clown. So, so how can you also look to help in your school? There is a Florida resource guide for you to look at where you can identify how you are doing as a school. It is a district checklist, but you can use it as well. You can use it for your school. They also have different kinds of, we're running out of time, but how to look at your EPs and see if your EPs are written correctly and that you are doing what you need for your gifted students.
So we're officially out of time, but we do want to take a minute or two and answer any questions that you may have before you head on to your next session. So if you would like to unmute yourself and ask a question or put a question in the chat, please feel free. And then we will get out of the way so the next group can start on time.
No.
Does anybody have any questions for us? So we do have our information in the chat. So if you'd like us to send you the presentation, we can do that. Also, keep an eye out if you are the equity representative for your school. We do have a 3-hour training through the equity department where you actually dig deeper into your school's population and also take a look at some of the opportunities that teachers can have to start looking for students who maybe are not identified. One of the things that we have as our follow-up for that is there's a checklist for teachers to do where over a 2-week period, every one of their students' names should show up somewhere on the checklist, which forces teachers to look at students in a different way. So if a student hasn't been written down at all in week 1, then you have to start observing them a little bit closer in week 2. And sometimes you find out that they've got a little magic that they've been hiding from you or that we haven't tapped into yet. So we look forward to seeing you in the longer training. And again, I'm Jacob Aronin. I'm here with Susan Teller. Please feel free to email any of us if you would like the information. I see some people are putting it in the chat, but we won't have that chat list. We'll see if we'll try and write it down before we are removed from the meeting and send it to the couple of you that have put it down. And we look forward to seeing you soon. Have a wonderful summer. I know you still have a couple more sessions today and then another day in the equity conference next week. And thank you for having us. And we look forward to more representation of gifted in your school.
Jacob, this is Laura.
Culture love thing is really,
yes,
the love notes that we do, well, that we used to do, the team building, being present, and she called it team wellness check-ins. I told you wellness.
Sign off, right?
Yeah. This was a lot about, this was social media and it's.
Hi, Jacob.
Thanks. Great idea, Ms. McFarland.
What's it called? Michelle put the Zoom list out, which she wasn't supposed to do. The worst comes to worst.
My daily.
You gotta sign up. You just pop in. Hey, let me tell you something. We ain't kicking nobody out.
Got a letter reached out and I.
Oh, so yeah, you gotta go to like the whole day though.
Yeah. Yeah. We're using the same email address.
I don't understand.
Yeah, and we'll be presenting from it here.
Yeah. Right. She wants to
Hi,
get a letter. I'm like,
Jacob.
yeah, well, that's not gonna happen. Yeah, it's the same thing about making her feel safe with Byron. So you already had that same conversation.
They're not gonna be.
Hi, Jacob.
They're not gonna be the same process.
Yes,
You need to separate Byron and Bruce.
I'm answering for Jacob.
Okay, yes, quick question. You presented the Florida resource guide for the gifted. Where is that actually located?
She's asking where the presentation is.
Not the presentation, but you showed a link for the
Nope.
Florida Resource Guide. for
It's
gifted.
in the
Oh, God, that's
presentation,
not
so
close.
if you click on the
Rock
presentation,
Island's looking for
it'll
deep in Fort Lauderdale.
automatically
That's far.
Susan,
There's
hold
a
on a
link.
second. There's a lot of people talking. I
That's
don't
that's
realize
close
that
to
they know
me.
that their
Where I'm
microphones are
at.
unmuted.
That's not, when you say he's close to here, I'm thinking Silver Trail.
Travis and Lysandra, your microphones are on.
Okay, I just muted everyone. So
Thank you.
if somebody has a specific question, now we can hear one person at a time.
Yes, so I was asking, I think a couple of slides prior to this, you showed a link that said Florida Resource Guide for the Gifted. I'm just wondering where, how would I locate that? Where is it located? Yeah, no, go back.
All right, so when you are on the slide, you can hear me, yes?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, it's actually on one of the slides. Hold on.
You can go to the Florida Department of Education
right here.
website, but they can't click on it, Susan. It's not like a live link on the
No,
slide.
it will be on the, if they get the presentation, it will be.
I know, but I'm telling her where to get it now. Go to fldoe.org and just type in the search button, Florida Gifted Resource Guide, and it will come up. The whole document is there. That comes from the state.
Perfect, awesome, thank you much.
You're welcome.
And the school self-assessment is part of that document. I just took it out and separated it.
Thank
Do we
you.
have any other questions?
I have a question. Just, have you guys ended your session before?
No, I guess we're gonna end it now.
Okay, because I want to just make sure the title is correct, Leading with Equity and Resourcefulness.
We're gifted, we're the gift from the, we're
So
stuck.
the presenters for the next session should be jumping on and taking over.
Okay,
Yes, we're here.
Okay, so
okay.
we're gonna
We'll leave.
leave.
So I can stay here?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. We're now getting ready at 1:55 to go into our Leading with Equity and Resourcefulness.